Well, good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. If you would, open your Bibles to the book of Psalms, where we had our scripture reading this morning, Psalms 90. That'll be where we will begin this morning. Sure good to see everybody out. Good to be back home after a trip of the Southland. Went and saw my parents and then the in-laws and ate plenty of turkey and dressing, giblet gravy, and all that good stuff. So it was good to see everyone down there. With this time of year, with it being the holiday season, everybody's on the move. With my family, we went to Manchester, Tennessee, to Harvest, Alabama, to Athens, Alabama, and then back to Morgantown in 72 hours. And then you got to think, well, I got to be at work on Monday. And then, we got kids that got this, I've got this. Everybody's just busy, aren't they? Smithsons are no exemption. You aren't no exemption. And because of that, many of us use this phrase right here. It'll work. There we go. There's just not enough time. I'm guilty of saying that for sure. There's just not enough time. But God has gave each of us on this earth, where none of us are special. I'm sorry to tell you, none of us are special. And we've all been given the same amount of hours, same 24 hours. But the scriptures are plain that we don't have any excuse when it comes to our spiritual priorities. Instead, it teaches quite the opposite. So in our scripture reading, that I appreciate Paul reading for us, in Psalms chapter 90 and verse 12, Moses, who writes this psalm, that's interesting, Moses writes the psalm in verse 12, he says, "So teach us to number our days, that we may present to you a heart of wisdom." That we may gain a heart of wisdom. Because the issue isn't the amount of time. I think we can agree with that. It's not the amount of time. We've all given so many seconds in a day, so many hours in a day, so many days in a month, so many days in a year. The issue is how you use it. Are you making the most of the time that you have in your life, in your day, and prioritizing what you need to, when you need to, in your service to God as a Christian? And I think that's something that all of us, whether you've been a Christian for many years, or you're a new Christian, that's something that all of us can struggle with, is prioritizing our time and using the excuse that there's not enough time. Well, I don't have enough time to do this. Work keeps me busy. I don't have enough time to serve God as I need to. Well, the kids have got ball or whatever. But I think this, through this study this morning, we're going to be able to look at God's answer to when we say we don't have enough time. Because the fact of the matter is, when we think about time in and of itself, time is a gift from God. If you turn over to the book of Ephesians chapter 5, Paul, in writing to the Ephesians in Ephesians chapter 5, talks about this very subject. In Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 15, Paul says to the Ephesians, he says, "Therefore be careful how you walk, not as unwise men, but wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. So then do not be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is, and do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit, singing to one another in psalms, hymns, spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord." Now, it's interesting that depending on the version, he says for us to, some version says walk circumspectly. I don't know what version you have. Some versions say circumspectly, but that's why I like the New American Standard versions of it. He says walk carefully. Circumspectly isn't a word that we use very often, but to walk carefully, live carefully. And then verse 16, making the most of your time. Some says redeeming the time. And then understanding what the will of the Lord is. He's telling us there in simple terms, I want you to make the most of your time. That while you're here on this earth, while you're serving as a Christian, I want your priority to be one thing and one thing only. That is getting to heaven and telling other people about how to get to heaven. Living for me, not for you. Now, as Christians, that can be a struggle for us. It can be a struggle in every single day of life because we can't manage time. I can't be like in the Old Testament making the sun stand still, right? Can't do that. But what I can do is I can control me, or I can work on controlling me. I can't control about the outside forces. I can't control deadlines and everything. Now, and you might think that at Drake's Farm Service I don't have deadlines I have to meet, but the amount of paperwork I do anymore is just unreal. I've got a big deadline coming here in 2 weeks that I have to have certain reports and everything done. I can't control that time is continually going, but I know I can control myself and make sure that I have myself prepared and the papers prepared so that when Denny says, hey, I want to see that report, I got the report ready to go. I can control me. I can control my actions. Same thing in our spiritual life. I can't control everything that happens in life. I can't control when the kids get sick. That puts me behind in doing something. I can't control about work wanting me to run late, but I can control what my actions are of me making serving God a priority, me making being here a priority. I can't control time, but I can control myself. That's why we see in the book of Proverbs, you flip over to Proverbs in chapter 16. In Proverbs chapter 16, the proverb writer there makes an excellent point, directly corresponding with what we're talking about here. In Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 3, he says, commit your works to the Lord, and your plans will be established. Your thoughts will be established. Commit yourself. That's interesting. Because when we think about commitment means staying with something, putting priority to something, doesn't it? That I am making it a priority, that it doesn't matter what outside forces affect me in my life, it doesn't matter what comes in my life, that my priority and the time that I have, I'm going to make the most of what I have, even though it might be limited. My time is going to be to serve Him, to be for Him. And that when people look at me from the outside, that they're going to see that, he could be out doing this, he could be out doing that, but he's not, she's not. They are prioritizing their time to be with their brethren, to being devoted to study, being devoted to prayer. Because Jesus makes this point also in the book of Matthew chapter 6, when he's talking on the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 21, when he's talking about fasting and treasure and wealth, in verse 19, he says, do not store up for yourselves treasure on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasure in heaven, where neither moth nor rust restore, where thieves do not break in and steal. Verse 21, he sums it up. He says, for where your treasure is, your heart will be also. We all have different things in our life that can be a priority. Work can be a priority, right? If I don't have a job, my youngins don't eat, the mortgage don't get paid. That needs to be a priority. I like deer hunting. I do. Been a terrible deer hunter this year, but I like deer hunting. If I make it a priority that, hey, when that northeast wind's going to be there, and the barometric pressure dropping, I'm going to be there. I want to make sure I'm committed, right? It's a priority. But when all those other things, civic groups, whatever you want to be a part of, ball team, whatever, when all that other stuff takes precedence over what God says do together when God says do together, you're not managing your time the way that it should. Because He's given us the time He has blessed us in our life to be able to serve Him, to be able to have these different things that we have in our life, to be able to have the clothes that we wear, the food that we're back, the car that we drive. And yet many times we put those physical blessings that we have, our friends, our activities, our hobbies, before the one who gave us the opportunity to have that in the first place. And yet we'll use the excuse, well, man, there just ain't enough time. You just don't understand, Caleb. I've got all this going on. I've got responsibilities going. Yeah, you do. Jesus could have said the same thing. Well, I'm up here running the universe. I can't help it. They sinned. They've got free will. They did it themselves. I'll let them. They'll just have to deal with the consequences. He could have said that. But yet He loved us enough that He wants to redeem us, which when you think about what the word redeem means, to buy back, right? He buys us out of the sin that we was through His death, through the blood of the cross. He buys us back so that we can use the time that we have on this earth, whether short or long, and be able to live for Him, to be reunited with Him. Because time follows treasure, schedules follow priority. Because time on this earth is short and it's uncertain. When you look at James chapter 4, in the book of James chapter 4, and verses 1 and 2, verses 14. That's the next verse. Verse 14, it says, "Yet you do not know what your life will be like tomorrow. You are just a vapor that appears in a little while and then vanishes away." Time's short. If you looked at the life of Methuselah, longest man's life we have recorded in the Scriptures, and had it in the span of eternity, it's going to look like a spit in the ocean. It is. That's why it makes a difference of what I do when I'm here. How I conduct myself while I'm here. I'm 35 years old, getting ready to be 36 here for too long. We were really, really close on Friday evening when we was heading to our in-laws of being in a head-on wreck. This is no joke, I was 3 inches away. We were driving down, 53 in Alabama? And we got about 20 foot away from a pickup truck, and for whatever reason, he decided to get in my lane at about 20 foot. Now, if I had been playing on my phone or whatever, not paying attention, there's a good chance I might not have been here. Thankfully, I swerved, got out of the way, and they didn't hit the van. But it was close. I'm telling you, it's the closest I've ever been in any wreck without it being a wreck. My life could have ended Friday night. Very likely would have, because it had been right where I was sitting at. And if I die today when I'm leaving here, 35 years in all reality in the span of the world is a short amount of time. It is but a vapor. I don't care if you live to be 100, it's still a short amount of time. But the difference is what impact are you having while you are here? Where are you setting your priorities? If I had died Friday night in that car accident, and my body's laying up there at Jones Funeral Home, and everybody's coming up there and look at me, and they look and say, well, Caleb sure did love deer hunting a lot. And that would have been true. But where would that have showed what my priority is? If you died tonight, what would they remember you for? Would they remember you for how much of a Kentucky fan you are? Or were they going to remember you for who you served? Because that's what really makes a difference. Who your allegiance is to, who you lived for, and that even when your time was limited, even when your time was short, even when life was busy, that you took the time that you had and made it a priority to serve Him. Instead of using the excuse that there's not enough time. Because if we look back at the book of Romans chapter 14, I've been reading from Romans 14 a lot, Brett, here lately. Romans chapter 14 and verse 2, or verse 12, verse 12. It says, so then each one of us will give an account of himself to God. 2 Corinthians 5:10, where it talks about where we will give an answer what we have done. When I die, I have to answer for what I've done, good or bad. And let me tell you, I've done a lot of bad things. But through the mercy and grace of God, He has gave me time to turn my boat around. Amelia's grandfather and I, was Grandy 93? 93? Me and Grandy, that's what we call him, Grandy. Brother Harwell, he preached for several years. We talked about that on Friday night. You know, Amelia's uncle, Brother Jeff Harwell, preaches in Tallahassee. He's a preacher. Of course, now I'm preaching. Brother Harwell's a preacher for many years. And Brother Harwell, sitting there across from me, he said, you know, he's in his sunset years, 93, right? He says, I didn't preach my first sermon until I was 32. He told me there's a lot of wasted years. What its exact words he used when he talking to me. He said there's a lot of wasted years of what I could have done for Christ. But boy, he made up for it in the time when he got to work. Because Brother Harwell, even working at the Redstone Arsenal and everything else, made it a part of his life to not use the phrase, I don't have enough time. Which it helps me relate to him because, he worked a full-time job in addition to preaching at a church full-time as well. You can't use that. You can't use an excuse. Because if you're looking for an excuse, you can find one. If you're looking for an excuse, you can find one to not work for him. Because when we think about it, what takes our time? Family, sports, whatever. But I'm going to propose that it's this right here. I'm going to introduce you to the I Don't Have Time for God starter pack. TikTok, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Netflix, Snapchat, overthinking, anxiety, any excuse you can make not to serve Him. Now, do I watch YouTube? Yep. Me and Davey watch the Outdoor Boys about every single day. If you ever watch the Outdoor Boys, pretty good show. About a father and son go out in Alaska and they bushcraft. That's what Davey wants to do. He said, Mama and the girls go to the beach. We go to the mountains. I said, okay. Facebook, TikTok. Ever heard? Y'all older folks might not have heard this term. Y'all ever heard of doom scrolling? Yep. Julia's hiding her face. She knows what I'm talking about. Doom scrolling, just scrolling for the sake of scrolling. And the bad thing is, half the time the stuff that you're seeing on there ain't worth seeing in the first place. Netflix, YouTube. Kentucky's getting beat again. Change channel. And Tennessee lost last night. I can't say nothing anyway. Overthinking, worrying about consuming our lives and things that ain't got a place. At the end of the day, don't matter. Because when it comes down to it, it's entertainment. Because in the grand scheme of this world, when all things are all said and done, 200 years from now, people ain't going to know what Snapchat is. It's going to be a blurb in history and it's going to be gone. 200 years from now, Facebook is just going to be a blurb in history about some guy named Mark Zuckerberg. It's just the way technology like that works. But I'll tell you something that has been around since Moses, book of Genesis. He wrote it for one, right? You take the Bible that took approximately 1,600 years to write with 40 different writers, that yet still today, 2,000 years after the death of Christ, still has relevance to every single one of ours, and yet we don't take the time because we say we're too busy watching YouTube or we're too busy on Snapchat or whatever, too worried about streaks, right? Right? I don't know how many times I got one for mowing streaks. But means a lot though, don't it? It does, yeah. Yet we don't have time to serve God. Now, we might think that these are 21st century problems, and they are. First world problems, y'all have heard that phrase, right? But when we think about what we see in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, where times change, but people don't. And it's the exact same thing of what we see in the New Testament in the book of Luke. In Luke chapter 10, we see this exact same thing happen with Mary and Martha, the good friends of Jesus. And Mary and Martha, in chapter 10 and verse 38, it says, Now they were traveling along, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into her home. And she had a sister called Mary, who was seated at the Lord's feet, listening to his words. But Martha was distracted in all her preparations, and she came up to him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to do all the serving alone? Then tell her to help me. The Lord answered her and said, Martha, Martha, you are worried and bothered about so many things, but only one thing is necessary, for Mary has chosen the good part, which shall not be taken away from her. Now, Martha wasn't doing evil. Preparing and helping to make the house, to make a sandwich or whatever she's doing for Jesus and his friends that have come, there's nothing wrong. That's admirable. We're commanded to be hospitable. But the difference is that when the Lord was talking, she was distracted. How distracted do we become? That's why he said in chapter 10, verse 42, one thing is needed. You know, the Hebrew writer, he expands on that in Hebrews chapter 12. In Hebrews chapter 12, in verse 1, he says, therefore we have so great a cloud of witness surrounding us. Let us lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which easily entangles us. But what? Let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Run with endurance. Let me tell you, you cannot run and do a good job on a race if your mind is preoccupied with something else. You cannot do a good job at work if you're worried about deer hunting. Testify to that, right? You cannot do the job that you need to do if you're distracted. You ever been driving and trying to get in a bunch of parking lot and you ever go through Atlanta? And you're trying to go through it and you got to turn down the radio so you can drive? Concentrate because, listen. Because you're distracted, right? That's what we've got to do. Turn down the distractions of the world and concentrate on one thing and one thing alone, because if you don't finish the race that's set before us, like we see in Hebrews, if you don't finish that race and say, well, that was fun, but I think I'm going to do something else. Being a Christian, I just don't think that's for me. There's a lot of people that do that. Yet if we are going to have our eyes set on the goal, have our eyes set on the prize, and say, hey, I don't want to be consumed with all of this, because there is good things on it. I'm not going to say that there's not. I was listening to a sermon from 1976 from Brother Robert Jackson on YouTube Saturday night. Brother Jackson's been dead for 20 years. There's good stuff on there. But when I'm watching the Outdoor Boys or Mr. Beast or whatever, y'all know that I watch. I'm more in tune with y'all. I'm not that much older than y'all, right? That I let it consume who I am and what I do. That's when it becomes a problem. That's when we have to say, I got to cut the ties. I need to get focused. Need to get dialed in, right? And to make my determination that I'm going to use the time that I have. Because, it might not be electronics, it might not be TV. It could just be worry. Could be anxiety. I've been guilty about that. Worrying about things that you have absolutely no control of. I remember earlier this year, I had, when I was growing them beans, and I was watching on the radar, massive hailstorm heading straight for the Davis Crossroads area. And I thought, well, thanks a lot, Chris Allen. I appreciate that. Right? There's nothing you can do to protect a 30-acre field of soybeans from a massive hailstorm, is there, Paul? Absolutely. There ain't a tent big enough to cover them up. So my amount of worrying, of me laying in bed going, boy, I should have bought that crop insurance policy. Ain't going to do me no good of worrying about it laying in bed. Ain't going to do no good worry about things that I can't control, of saying, boy, electric bill's going to be high. Coles are saying it's going to be this weekend. It don't make a difference. We have to have faith that the one that we are going to serve is going to provide for us. Because if we look back at what we talked about in Matthew chapter 6, in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 34, he says, "So do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will care for itself. Each day has trouble of its own." But if you read the verse before it, in verse 33, he says, here's how you cure that. "But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you." Is life going to be stressful? You betcha. Are things going to come our way that we don't expect? You betcha. Is life fun sometimes? Absolutely not. But if I have my priority set on, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what happens to me here. And I know that's easier said than done. I realize that. We're all human. But if we have our mindset on, is that I serve a God that can care for me regardless of what happens, and that I'm going to invest my time in Him, because you know what? If we invest our time in Him, He's going to invest it in us. It's a two-way street. That's why we have to make time. So, in closing, how does God expect us to use our time? Well, He expects us to use our time by putting Him first. As we said in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, He says, seek Him first. What we see in Psalms chapter 37. Psalm chapter 37 and verse 5. Psalm 37 and verse 5, if I never get there, 37 verse 5, it says, "Commit your ways to the Lord, trust also in Him, and He will do it." Will. Not might, not can, will. Do we believe that? Because if we're going to have that mindset, we have to have our spiritual priorities right. So what we have to do is ask ourselves daily is, what matters most to God today? What thing can I do to prepare for eternity today? Right now. What can I remove from my life that doesn't matter? That doesn't amount to a hill of beans? Because there's a lot of stuff, ain't there? Look over at the book of Colossians. In Colossians chapter 4, in verse 5, he says, "Conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity." Making the most of our opportunity. If you're doing something and it's not helping your soul, I think we have to ask ourselves a question. Why are you doing it? If it doesn't have value, why are you keeping it there? Now, if your shop or garage is anything like mine, you got a lot of stuff that ain't got value, right? I need to dump back a dump truck to my garage and throw away a bunch of stuff that doesn't have value. Yet if it's got value, I'm going to keep it. I've got some books, some old books that came from Brother Revis Petty that gave to my dad. That these books are quite near close to 100 years old, sermon books. Some of them are sermons that were preached in Nashville back in the 40s. I told some of y'all when I was down there at my mom and dad's this weekend, my great-granddaddy I've talked about for years as a preacher. Dad gave me a box of sermons that my granddaddy preached from the 1940s through the 1960s. Y'all are going to hear one of them here in a few weeks, because it's actually one that I've been working on, and there was a point I'd been working on forever and I couldn't figure out how to incorporate it. He wrote it down better than I could write it down. That's precious to me. I value it. I'm going to keep that in my life. All the most field and streams, throw them away, right? No value. But if you value something, you keep it close. And on top of that, we can use small moments in our life faithfully. Yeah, life is busy. I get it. But I promise you, you have 5 minutes every day to talk to God. You have time to call your brother or sister that's sick. Send them a message on Facebook. Hey, anything I can do for you? Give an encouraging word. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10. In Galatians chapter 6 and verse 10 it says, "So then while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all people, especially those who are in the household of faith." Me and Matthew have talked about that several times about, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but we've talked about, the importance of coming together, of being together when God says be together. All the hours that we have in our life, and yet a lot of times we have hard time dedicating 3 hours a week to be together to do what God says to be together. Where are we placing our priority? Where are we placing our time? Because, Jesus made time. Because if I'm too busy to serve, I'm too busy. Straight up facts. But the fact is, for sure, is that one day time will run out. We see in 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 10, he says, "The day of the Lord will come as a thief in the night." The world won't expect it, as we see in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 2. And what does he say in Revelation chapter 22 and verse 12? He says, "Behold, I am coming quickly." Could be today, could be tomorrow, could be next year. Who knows? But the thing is because you don't know, if you're here this morning and your affairs ain't in order, you better be getting it right. If I had been not paying attention, my affairs might have been in order right then on Friday night. We don't know when it's going to be. But the thing is, as we see in Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 27, we are going to have to give an account where it says it is appointed for men to die once, but after that is the judgment. Our use of time, of what we did with the time that we have, is going to be judged, whether good or bad. Now, it's up to you what that determination is going to be. But I believe each one of us can see, and I'm preaching to the choir here, I believe each one of us can see that I think each and every one of us, Caleb Smithson included, could do a better job of prioritizing what is actually important and in reality what actually matters. Because as we see in closing, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, it's one of my favorite passages. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, he says, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain." So the question we have to ask ourselves is, am I giving God the time He deserves? If someone examined your schedule, not your words, would they see a disciple of Jesus in you in the way that you spend your days? That's the real test. Because today, God calls us to redeem the time, refocus on our priorities, remove the distractions, and return our time to Him. That's what we got to do. If we want to be faithful, if you died today and they looked at you, would they know you for your accomplishments of what you did in your job, or would they know you for how well you spent your time of being a Christian and telling others about Him? Because eternity is a long time. Time on earth is short, and God deserves our best. Maybe you're here this morning and you haven't ever taken the time to give yourself to Him. If you're here this morning and you haven't made that a priority, you need to make following Jesus a priority. You need to make following Him and serving Him and being for Him the most important priority in your life. If you're here this morning, you've never come to Him through obedience and baptism, you can do that this morning. I hate to be morbid, but this could be your last day on earth. Don't do it not ready for the Lord to come back. Maybe you're here this morning and you haven't been setting your priorities the way that you should. You've been distracted by the world, been distracted by life. Make things right. As seen in 1 John chapter 1 and verse 9, He is faithful and willing to forgive us if we're willing to come to Him. Whatever your need is this morning, come forward as we stand and sing the song that's been selected.